When German POWs arrived in America, they encountered an unbelievable surprise. They stepped ashore expecting chains and contempt, and instead found a harbor that smelled of coffee and fresh doughnuts. It was June 4, 1943. Roughly 2,500 men of the Africa Corps climbed down gangways onto the piers of the Norfolk Naval Base expecting the rituals of humiliation the propaganda had taught them to expect. Jeers, shackles, the hard face of an enemy that would show them no mercy. What met them instead was noise and ordinary work. Dockworkers, black and white, moved side by side. Men and women operated cranes. A band played somewhere beyond the smoke, and guards walked with a civilian ease that disarmed before a single word was spoken. The ship's metal still vibrated under their boots. Gulls wheeled overhead, and the smell of roasted coffee mixed with yeast and sugar from a stack of doughnuts passed through the gate like a benign declaration. Life here would go on. The surprise hit them along senses they had been taught to mistrust. They had trained for spectacle, parades of humiliation, cinematic cruelty. Instead, they found competence and a kind of casual abundance. The docks were orderly, but not ostentatious. The harbor moved as a machine of trade and war at once. Crates were unloaded, trucks revved. Men who might have been enemies on a battlefield were, in that moment, just men doing their day's labor. For many prisoners, this first hour was less a single event than a sequence of small, accumulating contradictions to everything the Reich had told them. Stores with goods on display, working women operating heavy equipment, black stevedores handling the same shipments as white men, images that did not fit the narrative they'd been fed. A German prisoner later summed up the jolt in a single sentence. "We had expected chains. We found music and coffee." It was a short, almost defensive line, more a recognition than an explanation. A Swiss inspector who observed some of the camps noted in another brief account that the men looked surprised to be treated as men. These fragments of testimony are small, but they point to a larger cognitive dissonance. The visual language of American life spoke back to the prisoners in an idiom their propaganda had not anticipated. Those first impressions were not accidental. American policy and military practice at the time were guided by the Geneva Convention and by strategic calculations that treated prisoners as a resource to be managed, not merely punished. Yet the manner in which the United States handled these men, open ports, visible production, the casual normalcy of civic life, became an instrument of influence in itself. Visibility in wartime was not neutral, it was power. Letting captives see factories running, railways full, and bustling towns was a way to stage confidence. The next scene unfolded on rails. Prisoners were loaded into passenger coaches for trains that would carry them inland to camps. The trains, purposeful, not secretive, rolled through a cross-section of American life the prisoners could scarcely imagine from the other side of the ocean. Windows were thrown open. Men leaned out and watched fields and towns pass by like flashcards of a different civilization. Flour mills, smoking chimneys that meant work, signboards advertising everyday goods, small grocery stores with stocked shelves. At one point, the train skirted the Glen L. Martin aircraft plant. Where the prisoners expected smoke and ruin, they saw lines of aircraft under construction, men at benches, and the steady procession of parts moving toward assembly. "He counted bombers on the line and realized he'd been lied to," an account recalled. An instant of arithmetic and betrayal. If the enemy was producing like that, then the narrative of inevitable collapse crumpled. Civilians on the platforms reacted in a limited array of ways. A guarded stare, a wave, a curious child pressing against a parent's hand, a farmer tipping his hat. In some places, local people brought small gestures, bottles of water, a sandwich passed through a broken fence, a slice of watermelon set on the railcar step. One scene often repeated in recollections is banal and human. A farmer, his sleeves rolled, offering a prisoner a piece of bread and a nod. Not every interaction was warm. Many were neutral. But the sheer sight of abundance, well-stocked towns, running factories, busy stations, was a tactic in itself. Official reports and logistical planners understood this. Movement and exposure were ways to communicate a country's staying power, to make a point without firing a shot. That visibility had teeth because it was anchored in real scale. By 1943, American industry and transport lines were moving resources at a pace the prisoners could see for themselves. The trains, the mills, the assembly lines. These were not abstract statistics but visible certainties. Prisoners who had expected a ruined, collapsing homeland instead observed a productive engine that seemed inexhaustible. The sight of stable supply chains and the steady flow of goods undermined wartime myths more effectively than debate. It replaced ideology with lived contradiction. Not all of the revelations on the journey were about factories. The train carried smells and sounds that were untranslatable into propaganda. The scent of fresh bread from a town bakery joined the diesel and hay from passing fields. Children's laughter drifted from station platforms. In small towns where the train stopped, locals came to see the spectacle of uniformed captives, sometimes tense, sometimes curious. Some turned away, some waved, some offered simple food. One prisoner remembered a boy who, without understanding the slant of politics, thrust a sandwich through a gap in the fence because the boy's mother had told him to be kind. That single mundane act lodged in memory more firmly than any sermon. The trains were an axis of the American strategy of openness. They did not move prisoners in secrecy or in darkness. They moved them through daylight, along routes designed to maximize exposure to productive life. That design mattered. A captive who sees cranes and full warehouses, a working shipyard and a thriving town, comes to understand, in the simplest terms, that the enemy home front is not rotten. It is functional, organized, fed. Each station was a lesson in contradiction, each passing factory a counter-argument to propaganda. When the trains finally slowed at the camps, places like Camp Hearn in Texas, the paradox intensified rather than resolved. The camp perimeter was wire and guard towers, undeniably a place of confinement. Inside that boundary, however, the daily mechanics of life continued with surprising normalcy. Barracks had bunk beds with clean sheets. Ceiling fans circulated warm air. Electricity hummed. Meals were regular and by many accounts generous. Rations often came to about 3,400 calories a day, a fact that was as practical as it was disorienting to men whose home experience included shortages. Men received wages in camp script for various tasks, a small economy inside the wire that let them buy items for personal comfort. There were recreation halls, organized sports, and in some camps even observances of holidays with shared meals and music. Moments when the world outside became, in miniature, a place of routine dignity. Medical care in these camps was another revealing chapter. Hospitals on American soil were better stocked and staffed than many prisoners had experienced at home. The arrival of penicillin and its routine use in treating wounds and infections formed a sharp contrast to the medical shortages in the Reich. Where men had feared that injury meant a low chance of recovery, here they found modern wards, medicine administered with competence, and in some cases, German doctors who continued to practice under supervision. An uneasy cooperation that prioritized saving lives over ideology. A Swiss inspector noted the professional attention given to the sick. They received treatment comparable to civilian standards, an assessment that underscored the disconnect between expectation and reality. The pragmatic humanism of medicine, doctors treating men regardless of uniform, was a blow to the moral language of dehumanization the prisoners had been taught. The practical result was measurable. Survival rates for certain injuries and infections were higher in American hospitals than comparable figures suggested back in the Reich. That kind of survival is not an argument in a pamphlet. It is a bodily experience. Recovering men watched nurses and physicians move efficiently through wards, and the sight of competent care became part of what many described later as a slow, accumulating process of re-evaluating previously held certainties. All this, docks that smelled of coffee, trains that opened windows onto abundance, hospitals that saved faces, worked in concert. Inside the wire, prisoners built routines around work details, schooling, and entertainment. Outside the wire, in fields and factories, they labored alongside civilians, harvesting cotton or driving pegs in a warehouse, contributing tens of millions of man-days to the American war economy. These were pragmatic arrangements. Prisoners were paid small wages for their labor. But the human effect was greater than ledger lines. Working the land or drilling a floorboard, A prisoner would converse with an American farmer, exchange a laugh, or receive a bowl of stew handed over a fence. Those intimate encounters, the loan of a tool, the sharing of a cigar, a neighborly hand on a shoulder, were the places where ideology softened around the edges. Inside camps, culture and education flourished in odd and resilient ways. Men organized classrooms, lectures, and what came to be known as P-universities. They wrote plays, carved wood, painted scenes, and staged concerts. Those performances were not escapes from captivity so much as exercises in human continuity. When verses were sung or a small violin played, the prisoners reclaimed parts of life that war tried to erase. Guards sometimes attended concerts. Locals occasionally came to performances. In those rooms and halls, enemies became an audience and, for a few hours, a community. Music and theater did not erase culpability or historical truth, but they did create occasions for recognition that the other side was not a faceless abstraction, and yet all of this was edged with caveats. The Geneva Convention offered a framework, and U.S. policy implemented standards that were in part humanitarian and in part strategic. Treating prisoners well reduced the risk of retribution against American POWs, and it served as a form of soft power, an argument made without overt propaganda. Conditions varied between camps and over time. Not every camp matched the idealized images. Local attitudes ranged from generosity to indifference to hostility. The presence of the wire and the guard towers always kept the reality of incarceration in view. Still, the moment-to-moment surprises, those sensory dislocations and the slow accrual of evidence, shaped thinking in ways that were hard to quantify. A man who saw a working factory line whose wound was stitched and cured with penicillin, who found a choir to join or a class to attend, would leave the experience with more than memories. He would carry altered assumptions. For some, that meant skepticism toward the narratives that had shaped their loyalties. For a smaller number, it meant a choice at war's end, to return and reintegrate into a homeland that had been hammered and starved, or to seek a new life elsewhere. Official reports later noted that a not insignificant number of former POWs applied for visas and emigrated after the war, a complex phenomenon with many causes to be sure, but one in which the lived experience of America played a role. Back at the docks in Norfolk, the first small kindnesses had already left marks. A guard had once offered a cigarette to a young prisoner who could not stop staring at a crane. A woman at the pier rolled a bandage into a makeshift gift for a wounded hand. A brass band's notes drifted over the quays as trucks loaded and soldiers walked by. These were not grand gestures, but they were visible and human. They were, for the prisoners, evidence that an enemy could be competent, generous, and alive with ordinary routines. After Norfolk and the trains, after the arrival at the camps and an initial glimpse of medical care, another layer of the story began to unfold. Work details that sent prisoners beyond fences into fields and factories, and inside the wire a life that found ways to imitate the world outside. Men learned trades, exchanged jokes with civilians, argued with each other in classrooms, and staged plays that sometimes satirized everything they once held dear. One afternoon at Camp Hearn, a group of prisoners gathered in a makeshift classroom. Sunlight slanted through the slats, catching dust motes that rose and fell like slow snow. A German doctor who had been captured spoke in careful, measured words about a surgical technique he'd practiced on the front. An American medic listened, then asked a question about antiseptics. The exchange was practical, professional, almost clinical, two men trading knowledge about saving lives. For the prisoners in that room, the lesson was double-edged. Professional respect and human interchange in a place meant to separate and contain. It was the kind of mundane detail that, when stitched together with others, altered a picture painted by propaganda. Not all prisoners reacted the same way. Some clung to their beliefs, hardened by defeat and fear. Others split, accepting some aspects of what they saw, rejecting others. A number were cynical, convinced that the kindness was a tactic. But for many, the cumulative effect of open trains, effective hospitals, and shared music was to seed doubt. Doubt did not equal conversion. It did not erase complicity or ideology. It was rather a shift in internal geometry, a question where once there had been certainties. As the days blurred into weeks, routine did what spectacle could not. A man who began his incarceration seeing life as an argument against enemy propaganda might slowly find, through 1,000 small tasks and encounters, that the argument had weight. The wire circled a space where human life, the messy, ordinary, undramatic life of food, work, music, gossip, carried persuasive force. Those ordinary scenes seen in the raw made a particular kind of case, that a nation can be both a war machine and a place where daily life retains dignity. It is easy to recount a few standout moments: the smell of doughnuts at Norfolk, the sight of assembly lines, a nurse slipping a penicillin syringe into a wounded arm, and to let those images do the heavy lifting of interpretation. But the real story is cumulative. The way small elements combine to create an experience that contradicts prepared narratives. The prisoner's surprise was not dramatic in the moment. It was incremental, an accumulation of small human contradictions. And yet there remained unanswered questions as the story moved from arrival toward deeper patterns. How did medical practice continue within the camps? What was the role of captured German physicians working under supervision? How did the exposure to American industry on the trains affect long-term perceptions of what was possible in a society? What did everyday exchanges, sandwiches handed over fences, invitations to barn dances, the buying of a trinket at a camp store, do to the psychological boundaries between captor and captive? Those questions would be tested in the weeks that followed, as labor details took men far from the wire, as holiday rituals crossed the boundary between prisoner and local, and as the larger machinery of American production continued to hum just beyond their reach. The initial surprise had been sensory and immediate. What came next would be about endurance and choice. If the first hour at Norfolk unsettled expectation with the scent of coffee and the sound of a brass band, the weeks that followed transformed surprise into a steady, stubborn unease. Work details carried men beyond fences into a country that seemed to run on ordinary productivity. Education and art gave them reasons to breathe. Medicine returned bodies to life in ways their propaganda had denied. The surprise did not explode into an immediate conversion of hearts, but it accumulated day by day like a slow tide that reshapes a shoreline. If this story intrigues you, and you want more hidden histories from World War II, consider subscribing. There are more journeys like this ahead. Outside the wire, the landscape of labor became a classroom without walls. Prisoners were assigned to agricultural and industrial tasks that ranged from the intimate to the enormous. One morning a detail might be sent to a cotton field, where rows rippled in green and men bent to the rhythm of picking. Another day a gang would unload crates at a depot, stacking supplies that would cross an ocean. These assignments were paid work under camp regulations, small wages and camp script that could be spent at the canteen, and they contributed on a massive scale to the wartime economy. Official reports after the war referenced the enormous aggregate contribution of POW labor as measured in man-days. Historians summarize it as tens of millions of man-days, distributed across farms and plants in many states. That scale was not an abstraction for the men who lived it. It was a daily fact of life. The tasks themselves varied by season and by region. In the South, prisoners worked in fields harvesting crops under a hard sun, hands chapped, shirts damp with sweat. In the Midwest, they might find themselves in canneries and processing plants, the air thick with steam and the metallic clang of machinery. On the edges of town, small crews repaired roads, unloaded boxcars, and helped cut firewood for civilian homes. One repeated vignette shows a prisoner kneeling on the dusty floor of a barn, learning to drive a tractor under the patient eye of a farmer who had little appetite for politics, but plenty of need for hands. The farmer taught the machine. The prisoner taught nothing special in return except a nod of gratitude at the end of a long day. That private exchange, skill for skill, was a human transaction that eroded the distance erected by uniforms and wire. Hospitality appeared in small, unscripted ways. A sharecropper might leave a jug of lemonade on the fence where workers paused for a break. A town volunteer could bring a box of oranges to a work gang and watch as men peeled segments with quiet surprise. There are recurring stories of watermelons set down on a railcar step on a hot afternoon, slices passed hand to gloved hand, sticky juice on sunburned lips. In a rural county fairground turned temporary labor staging area, A woman whose own husband was away in uniform walked up to a prisoner, carrying a tin of cookies, and said nothing more than, "My boys liked cookies." The simplicity of that gesture, stripped of rhetoric, lodged in memory. These moments were mundane precisely because they were ordinary. Their ordinariness made them powerful. Not every encounter carried warmth. Some townspeople watched from porches, their expressions guarded. In places where resentment over the war or prejudice ran high, prisoners felt hostility, and guards sometimes disciplined transgressions with a firmness that reminded everyone that the state still held power. The wire remained both literal and figurative, an edge that defined the difference between being fed and being free. Still, the cumulative pattern, long days of work, routine provisions, occasional kindness, placed prisoners inside a working society rather than outside of it. That visibility, again, mattered. The men saw functioning markets, full shelves, trucks rolling with supplies, and the steady hum of civic life. It translated into a new measure of feasibility for the country they had been taught to despise. Inside the camps, daily life found its own rhythms. A typical morning started with roll call and breakfast, a bowl of hot porridge or eggs, maybe coffee. Men who performed maintenance or laundry in the barracks earned a few credits. Others volunteered for kitchen duty, which allowed a closer look at how food was rationed and prepared. In the recreation halls, chess games and card tables provided ordinary diversions. Some prisoners organized gym classes or played soccer on makeshift fields. The structure of the day, ordered, predictable, governed by routines of labor and leisure, was itself a lesson in social organization. Education became a motor for change in unexpected ways. Where the machinery of war had stripped away much ordinary schooling, the camps provided space for intellectual repair. Prisoners created curricula, inviting instructors, often fellow prisoners, to teach languages, mathematics, engineering, and literature. The universities that arose in many camps were makeshift but earnest. Benches for desks, blackboards fashioned from scrap wood, timetables announced in barrack corridors. A carpenter who had once taught vocational techniques became a beloved instructor. A former schoolteacher led classes in history that sometimes awkwardly circled back to recent events. The pedagogy was practical as well as aspirational. Men learned trades that could be useful after release. They debated ideas that had once been closed by doctrine. Lectures were sometimes attended by guards or by volunteer locals who came to see what prisoners studied. These shared intellectual spaces provided not only distraction, but also an occasion for cognitive reassessment. Art and performance offered another route out of rigid identities. Men built sets from discarded packing crates, painted backdrops with borrowed oils, and staged plays that ranged from German comedies to makeshift renditions of classics. Musicians found one another quickly. A violinist whose instrument had survived the capture organized a small ensemble that rehearsed in the evenings. Concerts were public events in the camp calendar. On special nights, the lights in the rec hall would be brighter and the audience larger, including sometimes the camp staff. One recalled seeing a guard, who had been taciturn throughout the day, leaning forward and listening as if the music suspended the gulf between them. On holidays, Christmas particularly, some camps organized meals that included local volunteers in small numbers. A chorus singing carols together, prisoners and civilians in a hall partitioned by barbed wire but not by song, became a potent image for many who later reflected on their captivity. Medicine threaded through these domains as both a practical necessity and a moral argument. American hospitals, field hospitals near camps and larger civilian hospitals in port cities, provided treatments that contrasted sharply with wartime shortages in Europe. Penicillin, which had become increasingly available in the United States by the early 1940s, played a visible role in reducing deaths from infection. A surgeon's skill coupled with reliable antibiotics turned what in older wars had been likely fatalities into recoverable injuries. Captured German physicians, when present, often worked in the wards under American oversight. Their professional identity remained intact even as their status as combatants had shifted. The sight of a man whose leg had been saved by modern treatment walking again was a daily embodied counterargument to claims of systemic decadence or collapse in the enemy homeland. Swiss inspectors and Red Cross reports noted care consistent with civilian standards in many camps. Their observations were not uncritical, but they emphasized the competence of medical practice. For a prisoner, surviving a wound and being treated with decency was not merely survival. It was a lived lesson in the value ascribed to human life on American soil. Experiences like these could provoke private reflection. A man who expected scorn might instead find his life worth saving to those who had the means to save it. That cognitive dissonance, this human being cared for by someone from the society he'd been taught to hate, was part of the slow work of erosion. The scale of American production and logistics that prisoners glimpsed on trains, at docks, and on roads reinforced what medicine made personal. Factories humming with activity, assembly lines where parts became planes, rail yards where cars were shunted with mechanical precision. These were the visible proof of a nation's capacity to sustain war. For prisoners who had been told repeatedly that their homeland would outlast enemies, the sustained intensity of U.S. production was an empirical contradiction. A man who watched a steady procession of aircraft frames move down a plant floor could perform a simple, devastating arithmetic. This is not production under collapse, it is production at scale. Some of the clearest transformations took place in the small, ordinary interactions that required no ideology. A farmer offering a bowl of stew across a fence did not lecture on democracy. He simply fed workers on his land because the work was hard, and someone needed a warm meal. A volunteer at a station handing out bottled water to men who had stood in heat for hours did not stand as a symbol of policy. She acted out of habit almost as much as compassion. Those unscripted acts had less to do with propaganda, and more with the habits of daily life. Neighbors helping neighbors, a culture of charity sustained by civil society institutions like churches and the Red Cross. For prisoners, these moments presented social facts that propaganda had often omitted or distorted. There were also moments of confrontation, where the friction between captivity and local life became explicitly political. Pro-Nazi leaflets occasionally surfaced among prisoners. Guards found and burned them. A small group of prisoners, influenced by earlier training or by personal conviction, resisted interactions and sought to maintain ideological purity. Camps sometimes held political education classes aimed at discouraging such tendencies. Authorities balanced the imperative of security with the longer-term aim of preventing radicalization. In this way, the administration of POWs was as much a governance problem as it was a humanitarian one. The United States' observance of Geneva standards was both principle and policy, and it created a context in which ordinary human contact could occur without immediately devolving into chaos. As months passed, some prisoners began to form attachments that would outlast their internment. A man might be invited to a community dance while on a work detail. He would sit at the edge of the barn floor, whiskey-smelling tobacco smoke curling overhead, and watch skirts whirl. A neighbor would call out a welcome and someone would offer a hand to a prisoner on rotation. Another man might be asked to repair a roof for a widow while a husband served overseas. The widow would talk about the children, the mortgage, the harvest. Those conversations, intimate as they were, muddied the clear lines of enemy and ally. They did not absolve or erase guilt. They created human connections that complicated simple categories. The end of the war and its immediate aftermath exposed the limits of what captivity could change. Some prisoners returned to Europe holding on to hardened loyalties, honor-bound to the old certainties. Others returned with questions that would not be easily answered. Official migration records and later surveys show that a number of former prisoners applied for visas and emigrated to the United States after the war. The decision to emigrate was influenced by many factors: economic devastation in Europe, family loss, political disillusionment. But the lived experience of American abundance and daily decency was often cited among the considerations. It would be inaccurate to present this as a single causal arrow. Reality was complicated. Still, for those who chose to seek a new life abroad, the camps had opened horizons they had not known existed. The psychological landscape inside returning men was varied. Some felt betrayal by comrades who had held fast to ideology. Others felt guilt for having found comforts under an enemy flag. Many felt weariness. A number of former POWs later spoke of private reckonings, conversations with brothers and fathers, letters left unread for years, guilt that was perhaps as heavy as any uniform. These were not stories of facile conversion. They were stories of human complexity, men confronting the dissonance between what they had been taught and what they had seen. The American state, meanwhile, considered pragmatic questions of military strategy and international law. Treating prisoners according to Geneva standards was not merely moral high ground. It was a means of reducing reciprocal mistreatment of American POWs and of projecting a form of legitimacy. Visibility, open ports, trains that passed through towns, camps where daily life imitated civilian norms, functioned as soft power. It was a way of demonstrating that a society could sustain itself, care for lives, and keep its moral bearings while prosecuting a total war. Soft power and hard logistics reinforced one another. Abundant production made humanitarian treatment possible. Humane treatment in turn bolstered claims of moral authority. That coupling was subtle but consequential. In the archival record, the cumulative images are striking. Photographs show men in neat barracks beds with clean sheets. Film reels show work gangs bending in organized rows. Inspection reports note adequate medical care and balanced rations. But the archive also preserves a less tidy truth. The lived experience of confinement, the barbed wire that circled it, and the uneven quality of encounters across regions and time. To say that the United States treated every prisoner as a friend is false. To say that every contact was warm is equally false. The truth is in the middle. A country practicing a policy of regulated humanity, with real acts of compassion, with constraints, with calculation, and with unscripted kindness. One illustrative scene, often repeated in memoir fragments, brings these strands together. A group of prisoners on a fall work detail had finished a day's work at a cannery and were resting under a grove of trees as the sun sank low. A local family had set out a blanket and a modest dinner for their own. Sensing the weariness of the men, they shifted the blanket so that the prisoners could sit. No speeches were exchanged. A child offered a slice of pie, and a prisoner, touched, replied with a smile. A small human assertion that neither weapon nor rhetoric had forced. Later, the man would recall that pie as a sign that life had continued here, and that memory would join others, the coffee at Norfolk, the stack of oranges on a fence, as part of his recalibration of what the world could be. Another episode comes from a medical ward where a German surgeon and an American nurse collaborated on a difficult case. The surgeon, accustomed to different protocols, demonstrated a suture technique. The nurse adapted and passed instruments in a rhythm that saved a man's hand. No ideological point was made. The two professionals simply did what their training required. For the patient, who later walked again, the memory of that shared competence was a kind of moral education. A demonstration that expertise and care crossed supposed divides. When historians and officials later tried to measure outcomes, they faced the same complexity. Surveys and reports noted altered attitudes among some prisoners, persistence of ideology among others, and a set of post-war migrations that could not be reduced to a single cause. Yet even cautious analysts acknowledged a persistent theme. Everyday life, in its mundane decency and its visible abundance, had persuasive power. The sight of a functioning society, the sound of a brass band on a pier, the taste of a donated piece of bread, the steady supply of medicine, all acted together to complicate propaganda. They did not turn prisoners en masse into ideologues of the captor. They created spaces where doubt could grow and where alternative narratives could find purchase. As the months of captivity stretched and the war's end finally arrived, the practical concerns of repatriation and reintegration took center stage. Some men, when returned to devastated homelands, resumed lives shaped by scarcity, loss, and rebuilding. Others sought emigration, reaching out through official channels to remain in the United States, drawn by the possibility of a life they had caught glimpses of while interned. Those choices were personal and varied, and they illuminate the limits of what captivity can achieve. It can open windows, but it cannot alone reconstruct a life. So what precisely made the surprise of arrival at Norfolk so consequential? It was not any single episode. It was the accumulation of sensory facts and practical experiences that contradicted the one-dimensional picture prisoners had been taught. The docks, the trains, the hospitals, the fields, the rec halls. Each element worked less as an argument and more as evidence. Evidence is stubborn. Over time, it shifts thought in ways that rhetoric rarely does. For some prisoners, that shift meant skepticism toward the narratives that had guided them. For others, it meant a pragmatic appreciation of the competence and kindness they had encountered. For many, it meant both, a confusion that required time, distance, and reflection to sort. The final image returns us to that first dock at Norfolk, where the ship's metal still vibrated underfoot, where coffee steam rose into gull-filled air, and where a brass band played as if life itself insisted on sound. The men who stepped ashore expecting ritual humiliation instead found ordinary human rhythms, work, music, food, medicine, that did not fit the caricature they had been given. That mismatch between expectation and reality was, in its way, an instrument of influence. It was not miraculous. It was not uniformly decisive. It was, however, an unbelievable surprise in the sense that it undermined certainty and opened space for doubt. In the end, the story of German POWs in America is less a tale of conversion than of encounter. It is a narrative about how a nation's ordinary capacities, its industry, its civic institutions, its medicine, and its people's small mercies, can work together to complicate an enemy's certainties. The wire was real, the camps were confinement, and the causes of post-war migration and ideological change were many. Yet among the instruments of influence on the home front, visibility and daily decency stand out as surprisingly effective. If this episode of Hidden History moved you, there are more archival stories and source lists in the description, films, inspection reports, and camp records that illuminate these scenes further. Watch next to explore the photographs and first-hand accounts that bring these vignettes into focus, and consider diving into the archives to see how ordinary life became, in its small ways, a form of persuasion.